Welcome to Mission Possible, our 5-part learning series on simplified accountable structure. This is lesson 2, and if you haven't had a chance to check out the first one on vision and goals, I invite you to view that sermon at this time. Our scripture for this lesson, 2 of them. The first is Matthew 25:14 through 30 from the Message. Jesus said, "The kingdom of God. It's also like a man going off on an extended trip. He called his servants together and delegated responsibilities. To one he gave $5,000, to another $2,000, and to a third $1,000, depending on their abilities. Then he left. Right off, the first servant went to work and doubled his master's investment. The second did the same. But the man with the single $1,000 dug a hole and carefully buried his master's money. After a long absence, the master of those 3 servants came back and settled up with them. The one given $5,000 showed him how he had doubled his investment. His master commended him. 'Good work. You did your job well. From now on, be my partner.' The servant with the $2,000 showed how he had also doubled his master's investment. His master commended him. 'Good work. You did your job well. From now on, be my partner.' The servant given $1,000 said, 'Master, I know you have high standards and hate careless ways, that you demand the best and make no allowances for error. I was afraid I might disappoint you, so I found a good hiding place and secured your money. Here it is, safe and sound, down to the last cent.' The master was furious. 'That's a terrible way to live. It's criminal to live cautiously like that. If you knew I was after the best, why did you do less than the least? The least you could have done would have been to invest the sum with the bankers, where I at least would have gotten a little interest. Take the $1,000 and give it to the one who risks the most, and get rid of this play it safe who won't go out on a limb. Throw him out into utter darkness." Our second reading is Matthew 7, verses 13 through 23, also from the Message. "Don't look for shortcuts to God. The market is flooded with surefire, easygoing formulas for a successful life that can be practiced in your spare time. Don't fall for that stuff, even though crowds of people do. The way to life, to God, is vigorous and requires total attention. Be wary of false preachers who smile a lot, dripping with practiced sincerity. Chances are they are out to rip you off some way or other. Don't be impressed with charisma. Look for character. Who preachers are is the main thing, not what they say. A genuine leader will never exploit your emotions or your pocketbook. These diseased trees with their bad apples are going to be chopped down and burned. Knowing the correct password, saying, 'Master, Master,' for instance, isn't going to get you anywhere with me. What is required is serious obedience, doing what my Father wills. I can see it now, at the final judgment, thousands strutting up to me and saying, 'Master, we preached the message, we bashed the demons, our super spiritual projects had everyone talking.' And do you know what I'm going to say? You missed the boat. All you did was use me to make yourselves important. You don't impress me one bit. You're out of here. These words I speak to you are not incidental additions to your life, like homeowner improvements to your standard of living. They are foundational words, words to build a life on." May God bless these readings of the Word. Well, friends, if you have been checking your investment portfolio or perhaps your grocery receipts lately, you know that our economy is having a really rough patch right now. So it might seem strange for right now to be reading Jesus' parable of these servants who took risks and invested their master's money while he went away on a trip. So I just want to start off with a disclaimer that in no way is this sermon, this lesson, in no way is the takeaway about financial advice. So just putting that out there. Instead, we are returning to this popular parable to remind ourselves of its spiritual truth, that God holds God's servants accountable. One of the most core Christian beliefs is that God holds us accountable for our sins, and that's why we need Jesus' work of atonement in our lives. But God also holds us accountable for the resources that God entrusts to our care. See, I am accountable to God for everything that God has put me in charge of. The money that I earn, the child that I parent, the land I live on, the advice I give to others, and the pets I care for. And collectively, we, the church, are accountable to God for the land that the church owns, for the building that we worship in, for the church bus, for the church's finances, and most importantly, for the people who walk through the church's doors seeking God's love. If we care for God's resources poorly and we lose them, then we have not met our master's expectations. And if, like the cautious servant who buried his master's money in the ground, if we merely strive to preserve God's resources, if we just try to maintain the status quo, well, it seems like God is not satisfied with that either. The faithful servants, Jesus' parable teaches us, are those who are willing to take risks in order to gain something for God. That work is vigorous and requires total attention, but it is the way to life. And it doesn't matter how much or how little we are given to begin with. We are only accountable to God for what we choose to do with it. Now, God gives many different kinds of resources, many different kinds of gifts and responsibilities to different people to care for. And some folks are given a specific responsibility of leadership in the church. And so today our focus is on accountable leadership as part of the organizational structure of a church. For a year now, our church has been discussing possibly changing our organizational structure, but no matter what model we use, our organizational structure needs to be clear. But what is an organizational structure? It is the arrangement of responsibility, authority, and accountability in leadership and ministry. Responsibility, authority, and accountability. This is from John Kaiser's book called Winning on Purpose. A few of the church council members and I read that book last year together. In it, he shares that responsibility is the duty or obligation to complete a task to a satisfactory degree by one person, and that part's important. Authority, then, is the power to give direction or to make decisions in order to fulfill one's responsibilities. And accountability is the willingness to account for one's actions and results. So to give an account is to give a report, and to be held accountable is to experience some kind of consequence, positive or negative, based on the content of that report. Now, somehow there is this pervasive belief that because the church is made up of mostly unpaid volunteers, that no one can be held accountable, except maybe paid staff, maybe. Churches really like to be nice, so sometimes churches would rather keep an ineffective staff member on rather than hurt someone's feelings. But accountability is highly biblical. Jesus gave us not only this parable from Matthew 25, but also this parable about a woman turning her whole house upside down to find a single lost coin. We also have this vision of Judgment Day where Jesus says that the nations will be separated like sheep from goats based on how people lived their life and treated others. There's even a very strong warning from Jesus against cautioning us against causing other people to stumble in their faith. how we manage God's resources, how we use our positions of leadership and our influence over others, that matters to God. It does not matter if that leader is paid or not. All of the leaders of the church must practice accountability for the sake of our mission. And Methodist churches, we have accountability built into our DNA. From the very beginning, our accidental founder, John Wesley, he put Methodists into small groups to meet weekly in order to give an account of how they were living their lives day to day as Christians. How's it going? And when the group leaders took up a collection at those small groups, they meticulously recorded every penny. Every year, the Methodist clergy would gather together to conference, and primarily their work was to report on church membership, baptisms, finances, and church property. These were accountability tools. And today, we are still doing a version of all of these things. And yet, when it comes to achieving the mission of the church, our practices of accountability are either not robust enough, they're not inspiring us enough, or they're not expecting enough of us because we're not taking big risks with them. Many churches are living cautiously, preserving the status quo, and doing less than the least. This is fairly universal across denominations, across all U.S. cities. This is a phenomenon nationwide here. And part of that is simply because we're not that familiar with robust practices of accountability in our church structures. So today we're going to be looking at three different kinds, three basic kinds of church government structures. So the first type of a church structure is a bureaucratic structure. Bureaucratic structures are committee-based and often driven by seeking consensus. So here, the committee gives the pastor the responsibility to achieve the mission of the church, but not the authority to do so. The committee keeps most of the decision-making powers for themselves, which means that decisions are made slowly, if they happen at all, and the decisions will not always be focused on the mission, because if the group is trying to reach a consensus, then there might be compromises made on the mission in order to keep everyone happy. The role of the pastor, as well as other staff members, is limited in this role. They are simply employees. In this model, the pastor and the staff are evaluated by members of the congregation, which usually means that they're judged on some kind of personal preferences rather than something objective, some kind of assessment on whether the church's goals are being met. And because the committee keeps the authority to make decisions for themselves, and it's a group, it's really difficult, almost impossible, to hold anyone accountable. Unless you're planning to fire an entire church committee, you can't hold groups accountable. And I've just never seen a church fire a whole group of people. That probably would not go over very well for the relational dynamics of that congregation. That said, this model of structure is technically very safe for churches. Because the members, the committee members together have the decision-making power, they will make sure that there is no abuse or funny business going on. It is a safe structure, but it's not effective. It's kind of like a placebo. See, when the FDA is regulating, evaluating new drugs, the drugs have to be proven to be both safe and effective at doing whatever it's supposed to do. So while a bureaucratic structure is safe, it won't effectively achieve the mission. The next type of structure is autocratic. Autocratic structures are led not by a group, but by a single person. And in a church, that's the pastor. Here, the pastor has both the responsibility to achieve the mission and they are given the authority to make it happen. But there's no real consequences if they are not successful. The pastor makes all the decisions, all the major ones at least, and so decisions can happen really quickly, sometimes impulsively or unrealistically, and dissent is not tolerated. If there is a committee, they are essentially a rubber stamp for whatever the pastor wants. In this model, the pastor and other staff members operate like dictators. Everything and everyone reports to the pastor, which creates this kind of dependency in the congregation. They're dependent on the pastor, and the laity end up feeling run over and disempowered, and the pastor spends all their time putting out fires. If you have this model and your pastor is very charismatic, growth in the church can happen really quickly. But decline can also happen very quickly, especially if the pastor has a scandal or if there's simply a pastoral transition. If you are interested in hearing some cautionary tales to learn from for charismatic pastors in this model, there's a popular podcast you can listen to that tells the story of a charismatic, non-denominational pastor in Seattle whose church recently imploded. And there's a new Netflix documentary coming out that seeks to expose the toxic and criminal scandals about a pastor-centric church in Australia. I'm not going to say the names of those, but a quick Google search, you can find it pretty fast. This model is like a narcotic. It is effective, but you better watch out. It can be addictive and highly dangerous. Well, if bureaucratic is safe, but not effective, and autocratic is effective, but not safe, then what kind of structure is both? That is accountable leadership. This model is like medicine, fully approved by the FDA as both safe and effective. Here, the pastor and the staff are given the responsibility and the authority to achieve the mission, and they are held accountable. Here, the pastor and staff can be leaders, operating efficiently within safe boundaries established by the governing board, which we'll hear a little bit more in session 3. Now, to apply accountability in this model, you simply ask 2 questions. First, are the mission and goals being accomplished as agreed? Second, are there any agreed upon boundaries that are being violated in the process? If the mission is getting accomplished and there are no boundary violations, then any method of ministry is permissible. So who is it exactly that asks these 2 accountability questions? Well, there's a flow chart, a pathway of accountability for a simplified accountable structure. So at the top, the governing board is accountable to Jesus. And really, we all are, but the governing board is particularly accountable for whether the church is making disciples. And because you can't really hold a group accountable very well, the board members have to covenant together to individually hold each other accountable. Each individual member of the governing board is charged with, trusted with, holding each other accountable. So to achieve the mission of making disciples, the governing board sets some goals. We talked about that in session 1. And then the pastor is accountable to the board for achieving those goals. And that is what the board bases their annual evaluation of the pastor on. It's not simply, do we like the pastor? Do we enjoy their sermons? Do we, like their family? It's, here's the goals. Is the pastor achieving the goals? That's what you evaluate them on. Next, the staff and ministry leaders are accountable to the pastor. Quick caveat, in SAS, staff might be paid or unpaid. And so I'm using both staff to refer to paid members as well as unpaid ministry team leaders. So either one, we're all kind of talking about that same level of leadership in the church. They have kind of the same level of responsibility, at least to some degree. So the staff and ministry leaders, they are accountable to the pastor, and they work with the pastor to establish ministry objectives. These are kind of like the sub goals. They are the things that are going to help achieve the church's overall goals. And then the pastor evaluates the staff and ministry leaders based on the achievement of those objectives. It's the same thing. The staff are not evaluated by the pastor's preferences. They are evaluated by something that is measurable and objective. Lastly, the staff and ministry leaders hold ministry team members, the congregation members who are involved in ministries. They are held accountable too. So occasionally, a person may actually be asked to stop serving in a particular role if they are proving to be ineffective at it, or if they violate some kind of ethical boundary. Those conversations are never easy. We know this. It's why we don't do it very often. But we have to do them with love and care, because the mission of the church should be non-negotiable. And if you have someone who is serving in a ministry role because they've done it for 50 years and they're going to do it till they die, the harm that they can cause to a new person in the church is not worth it. Everyone has some kind of gift, some place where they can serve and be effective at it. And so our job is to identify the places where someone is serving in not the right position and try to put them in a position where they will thrive, where they will be successful. And that happens, of course, after conversations. If you can try to fix the problem first, of course we do that. But if it becomes impossible, we don't allow harm to continue. For the sake of the mission of the church, for the love of God, we put the mission first and put people in positions of leadership and service based on what the mission needs to succeed. Now remember, none of this accountability is based on personal preferences anymore. So it doesn't matter if a 50-year member of the church only wants to sing the old hymns on the organ. If you have a director of music who is effectively making new disciples because they started a rock band of high schoolers that are playing in worship once a month, if that is achieving the mission and there's no policy violations or ethical violations happening, then the director of music gets to choose what the ministry looks like because they're achieving the mission. But the people helping to do the ministry also get to help determine whether the ministry is actually effective. You get to do a little bit of a cost-benefit analysis here. So for example, if that rock band is costing the church $20,000 of equipment and only making one disciple, you could compare that to a ministry that costs, a music ministry that costs maybe $1,000 a year and is making 10 new disciples. So you can compare effectiveness of ministries in that way to see, to gain some kind of objective assessment of that. So the way that you do that, the way that you assess whether a ministry is effective is by using a cycle of accountability in order to apply accountability to specific programs and events. So these ministry teams need to figure out, first, if the program or event even aligns with the mission of the church. There are some things that are like fun to do, but if they have absolutely nothing to do with the mission of the church, like not even tangentially, then why are we doing it? There are other organizations in the community that can just have fun. So everything that we are doing should in some way be connected to the mission of the church. Next, the ministry team leaders need to figure out if the event or program ended up having fruitful outcomes. And then were church resources to put on the event consumed in a responsible way. And if the answers are yes, awesome. How can we make that event better? And if not, then the ministry team either needs to adapt their strategies or end the program. It is a good thing to let go of things that are not being fruitful. It is a good thing to prune the tree so that other areas have more room for growth. It can be hard, but holistically, it's what's healthiest. So here's specifically what that process looks like. The accountable leadership cycle. Before a program or a ministry event ever happens, the mission and the vision must be considered first. And then there's a phase of discerning and researching what kind of ministry would actually work in your local mission context. Generally for us, that's Newberg, Oregon, but more specifically, you could say it's 0.5 miles of our church campus. Then you make some plans and set specific goals or objectives, because if you start with a goal, then you have something to measure against at the end. Life tip here, if you never put up a target, you will never hit a target. Then implement the ministry. Do the special worship service, have the pie sale, do the Easter egg hunt, perform the Christmas cantata. And once it's done, evaluate the fruitfulness. Did we achieve our goal? Did we even come close? And then intentionally reflect and learn. And use that opportunity to gain better understandings of the people we're trying to reach, as well as becoming better leaders ourselves. And finally, use those learnings to discern and research for the next program or event. Now, I know, and we should all be able to admit to ourselves, that not every program or event will be a home run. I remember years ago, my mother was asked to provide a pie for a church auction, and my mom said yes, sure. She went out and spent $10 on ingredients and spent 2 hours making this homemade pie. And at the auction, it sold for $7. And you know, my mom decided she was never going to bake a pie for a church auction again. It wasn't worth it. She learned something, and she decided to just straight up donate $20 next time she was asked to help out with that particular event. Because in a way, you know, God holds us all accountable. And so if you think about God holding my mother accountable for the way that she used her resources, her $10, her 2 hours, it ended up not being a great use of resources. She didn't know that at the time. She had to go through it to learn that lesson. But because she learned from it, she changed her actions for next time. She found a way to be a better steward of her resources the next time. And not only a better steward, but also a way to make a bigger difference with her resources. The impact of her $20 donation the second time made a bigger difference than the $7 when the pie first sold at auction. So it's because of real life lessons like that I think there is more to Jesus's parable than first meets our eyes. You know, I just don't think that the first 2 servants that went out with their master's money, I don't think they took one single calculated risk and ended up both doubling their money. I mean, it's possible, but it is not probable. Those faithful servants probably made many choices over time, and some of them were obviously great choices, because in the end, the result was that they doubled their money. But I'm willing to bet that some of their investment choices, if it's anything the way investment goes today, some of their choices may have actually lost them a little bit of money, maybe a lot of money. But if they did make mistakes, then clearly they learned from them, because they did not continue that pattern of loss, because by the end of it, the results had grown. They had doubled. So clearly, if they had made some mistakes along the way, then they learned from them and tried different strategies until they found something that worked, until they were successful. So yes, we are accountable to God for how we use our gifts and our positions of leaderships. But that doesn't mean we're never allowed to fail. A significant part of accountable leadership is talking with others about those failures, learning from them, and then trying something new. A significant part of accountable leadership is getting encouragement, is having other people to kind of bounce ideas off of. It's more about how can we support each other to do our roles in the church to the best of our abilities. And we keep learning, we keep trying something new until the trend is toward success. That is how we're going to get to the point where we stand before our Master, our God, as a faithful, fruitful servant. And that is how we will hear God's praise. Good work. You did your job well. From now on, be my partner. May we each find the path to become one of those fruitful, faithful servants. Amen.